Um, and I'll just make in my brief remarks here just about three key points that hopefully won't branch off into too many subpoints. And before I tell you those key points, I'll just tell you a little bit about the work I've been doing. So I'm a lecturer in film, media, and cultural studies at Birkbeck, and I've been working on this AHRC grant-funded project, somewhat ostentatiously titled "Political Ideology, Rhetoric, and Aesthetics in the 21st Century: The Case of the Alt-Right." And you can get a sense of, from the titles of some of the things we've published, the work we've been doing. So really, we've been just trying to think about what is the overlap between rhetoric or forms of argumenting, of making argument, forms of persuading, forms of convincing people, the relationship between that and aesthetics and politics, and how does that take shape and cohere on different kinds of political platforms. So we've looked at YouTube, Reddit, 4chan, and other places as well. And this research came out of conversations that the PI, Alan Finlayson, had and I had about the kinds of reactionary cultures we were seeing online. And we started talking about this before we realized alt-right was going to be the brand name that it became. I was spending a lot of time on Reddit, which is a sort of a message board and social news site that's hugely popular and I still think understudied. And I was seeing a lot of really racist discourse, a lot of anti-Semitic discourse, a lot of misogynistic discourse. And this was in kind of 2010, 2015, sort of that range, because I've spent far too many years on Reddit. And a lot of the conversation about sort of social media was still that it was liberatory, that it was democratizing, that it was a way to allow more people into the conversation. And I was seeing something different happening. So Alan and I started to talk about that. And then, of course, Donald Trump won the Republican nomination for the presidency and then eventually the presidency in the US. And suddenly the alt-right was everywhere. And so this leads me to my first key point, which is that the alt-right is supposed to be the name of a movement, but I actually think it is already sort of past, it's sort of crested in importance in some ways. And partly this is because it never really named a movement, it named a kind of ideology, a kind of orientation to digital culture that had a particular aesthetic practice, particularly meme culture, a particular style, irony that comes along with trolling, the kind of idea that you never mean what you say, you're just trying to poke people and see how they'll respond. But it was never really a movement in the way we typically think of movements in the sense of there wasn't a kind of coherent political plan. There wasn't an effort to really influence, at least not directly, mainstream politics. And this kind of leads me to my second point, which is that there's this inverse relationship between the obscurity of these sorts of communities and their reach, their ability to influence more broadly. And a lot of these groups, and I'll give some examples of this, really rely on obscurity. The whole kind of point of the group, the fun of being in this group, is that people in the mainstream, liberals, the left, who for them kind of include anyone who disagrees with them, those people don't know what you're talking about. So you're having fun because you have your kind of coded racial slurs, you have your in-jokes, you have the memes that, as they would say, normies don't get. So the fun of being part of these groups is that people don't know what you're talking about. So the more people know what you're talking about, the less sort of vital your group becomes. So this is one of these paradoxes of the alt-right, which is, on the one hand, you could say they're very influential because there have been MPs here in the UK using the phrase cultural Marxism, which is something that comes out of the alt-right. But on the other hand, insofar as their memes become more accessible, the community starts to die and starts to become less active and starts to become something that people associated with the group reject. So now if you go on 4chan, the politics board, Paul, which was often cited as a kind of the home of the alt-right, none of them would describe themselves as alt-right, right? They would fall under the category of what we as researchers or sort of people interested in this sort of thing would say, oh, that seems like alt-right to me, but they'd say, no, I'm not an alt-right person. That's kind of normie, that's old, that's over. And you can also see this reflected a little bit in this chart, which is Admittedly a crude measurement, but this is Google Trends, searches for the alt-right globally over the last 5 years. And you can see there's 3 spikes. One is September 2016, and this is when Hillary Clinton released a press statement saying that Trump was using a white supremacist symbol because he had retweeted something that included Pepe the Frog, who it's because of what I just said, the obscurity of these groups is really important. I'm not sure how many of you already know about Pepe the Frog. Maybe everyone does, but it's a cartoon frog that became sort of a mascot of trolling, and specifically white supremacist trolling. And Trump retweeted a meme that included Pepe, and Hillary released this press statement saying he's using a white supremacist symbol, which was true, but it was also walking right into the kind of trap that trolls set for you, which is as soon as you take them seriously, you start to sound like a fool, right? You're releasing a very serious statement about a cartoon frog. And of course, these groups love that, and that was great for them. And they thought it was hilarious. So that's one spike. The next is in November when Trump is elected, and there were people trying to figure out how could this have happened, and there was a period, sort of a brief news cycle of saying the alt-right was sort of behind it, and that didn't sustain for very long because I think it's pretty clear that Trump had a lot of mainstream Republican support. And then the other spike is 2017 after the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally, when someone a man killed a woman by running her over with his car, and then was also in the news. And that was a very explicitly anti-Semitic event as well, where they were chanting "Jews will not replace us." And then after that, interest really falls off dramatically and hasn't really returned. And I think this is partly because these groups sort of run out of steam as they try to move beyond the kind of obscurity of their message board communities, which is not to say they're not dangerous or that they're not important. It's just to say that it's difficult to think about them in the terms of sort of mainstream politics, right? Because from the perspective of a lot of the members of this group is that they don't care about what we think as sort of people who would come to this talk and be interested in it, right? Our ideas and opinions don't matter. They don't want to influence us. We're their enemy. Mainstream politicians are their enemy. So they are dangerous and they are violent. You may have heard of the Boogaloo Boys, who got some attention last summer as they appeared at Black Lives Matter protests. But they're very kind of pro-gun community that are sort of advocating a second civil war in the U.S. And have been associated with some attacks on police. And the image so that's an image of their meme, making a meme out of that St. Louis couple you may remember, who waved their guns at some Black Lives Matter protesters who were near their property, and then they kind of put them into the Grand Theft Auto video game and made a meme out of that. So this kind of celebration of violence does have connection to actual violence. The other image on the right is from 2015. Some users of the 4chan Paul board went to a Black Lives Matter protest in Minneapolis, and they live streamed their trip there, and they're sort of using their coded racial slurs that have changed now, but they were kind of using the coded racial slurs they were using at the time, that were in vogue at the time in these groups. And they showed up at a protest and shot off a few rounds and didn't kill anyone, but injured people. So this sort of sporadic violence, I think, is something that's characteristic of these groups. And there's a danger to that, but I don't think it's the same kind of danger you would see from a kind of a coherent, organized political group. So there's a way that these platforms sort of inculcate particular ideologies, orient people to the world in particular kinds of ways. And many of these communities are relatively large, if entirely obscure from the mainstream. So an example of this is Paul Joseph Watson, who is not really well known, but has a really dedicated following, regularly gets millions of followers on YouTube. There's lots of figures like this who you wouldn't know about if you weren't part of that community, but they have a dedicated following, but they exist almost in a kind of parallel ecosystem. They're not interested in influencing the mainstream. They have their own kind of parallel ecosystem, which is something that these platforms enable and sustain. So there's a way, in the mainstream, we become aware of them sometimes when they coordinate and have trolling activities and sort of go after journalists, dox people who research them. They go on the attack, but a lot of what happens is about kind of coordinating their own kind of community. and sort of very internal, inward looking. And there's this kind of inverse relationship between wider attention and the obscurity they rely on. And when Vicky invited me to this talk, I started to think more in detail, because my sort of first thought was, well, actually, Holocaust denialism isn't all that important for the alt-right, at least discursively. They don't talk about it much. And although they are definitely anti-Semitic, they don't always talk about it. You hear a lot more, you see a lot more discussion about Islam. That tends to be the primary concern, is the fear of Islam spreading, of sort of falling Europe as a result of Islam. But then as I also thought about, the way these groups work is that they entirely, as I've been saying, they sort of reject mainstream politics entirely and mainstream discourse entirely. And one of the ways they do that is through this brazenly racist sort of trolling. And this is one way that anti-Semitism is really important for this group. And this is partly due to the history of message board culture and the way arguments have always happened online. So there's something you may be familiar with if you spend too much time on message boards, which is Godwin's law, which is dates back to the era of Usenet, which is the early form of message boards. And the Godwin's law is that the longer an online argument goes on, the more likely it is someone will make an analogy to Hitler and compare you to Hitler. So Hitler is kind of the uncontroversial incarnation of evil, and Godwin's law is supposed to be pointing up how ridiculous online arguments can be, that it always ends up with someone being compared to, the most evil person who's ever lived. And then the alt-right makes use of this because their anti-Semitism is so brazen and obvious, it's not hidden or obscured at all. And the point of it is that if you can laugh at these incredibly obvious anti-Semitic tropes, what you're laughing at is not the anti-Semitism, you're laughing at the fact that everyone knows, so to speak, right? That everyone knows anti-Semitism is wrong, that Hitler is bad, that the Holocaust was a horror. So everyone knows that. So you're not being anti-Semitic by laughing at that. You're laughing at all these fools who have come to this agreement and are unquestioning and don't sort of consider anything but the kind of common sense narrative that they've been told their whole lives, right? This is a sort of alt-right way of thinking, right? So if you're able to laugh at something like a meme that is commonly used as a reaction meme and has a history on 4chan politics board, a Shlomo Shekelstein, which is also called the Happy Merchant, which is a very, it kind of hits every anti-Semitic trope. I'm not going to share the image because I don't think it's useful necessarily, but it's a clear sort of caricature, anti-Semitic caricature that no one would mistake for anything else but that. So there's no effort to be subtle at all, right? And that's the point. The point is, this is so obviously racist that if you try to explain to me that it's racist, you end up looking silly. I'm just laughing at this sort of mainstream agreement over things and the way so many people have accepted a particular way of thinking without challenging it. So there's no point in trying to tell me that it's racist. Obviously, I know that's racist. What I'm really making fun of is sort of the way everyone is sort of unthinkingly following whatever they're told, right? That's the sort of alt-right perspective. So in that way, anti-Semitism works as a kind of entry point, right? So if you can laugh at that, if you can laugh at things that are cherished or held to be true by a wide number of people, if you can laugh at that, then that shows you're edgy, that shows you have a sense of humor, that shows you're a critical thinker, right? From that perspective. So then that opens you up. That's a way you can be opened up into this sort of larger world of anti-Semitism, and then along with it, other forms of racism, right? And as I said, most of the discussion is about Islam and women, really, right? About it's misogynistic and it's Islamophobic. So the kind of, in terms of sort of text, word count, anti-Semitism isn't all that important, but I think it plays a structuring role in these communities because, as I said, from the history of sort of internet argumentation, the Godwin's law saying that eventually someone will compare someone to Hitler. The point of that is Hitler is uncontroversially bad, right? So if you can laugh at a joke that makes light of the Holocaust, it's not that you're denying the Holocaust, it's that you're able to laugh at what everyone else thinks is uncontroversial. And that ties back to the whole point I was making earlier, that these groups aren't really interested in influencing the mainstream, right? They're influencing they're interested in laughing at the mainstream and making fun of it, which again is not to say it's not dangerous, but that I think sometimes some of the discussion about the alt-right, I think, misses what is dangerous about it, which is that it is about creating sort of parallel political communities, not about influencing sort of mainstream politics. So anti-Semitism plays a key role in that as a kind of way of sort of opening up other forms of sort of challenging what everyone sort of already agrees with, so to speak. So I've already run over my time, but so I'll stop there, and then we can kind of come back in discussion and talk more about some of these issues, I'm sure. Thank you.